They burned their own capital. Jamestown, once the seat of English power in Virginia, reduced to ash by the very men it was meant to govern. Not a foreign army, not a distant king, but English settlers rebelling against their own government. How does a society built on liberty turn on itself? How does frustration become violence? Because this wasn't just a rebellion, it was something more dangerous. It was the moment when trust collapsed, and when liberty, unmoored from order, turned into force. To understand how it happened, we have to return to a divided society already under strain. In Virginia, power belonged to a small group of elite planners, men who controlled land, trade, and government. They governed from the coast, protected by wealth, distance, and influence. But far from the river, on the frontier, life was very different. There, survival came without protection. Raids were common, violence unpredictable, and when settlers asked for help, they often received nothing. The government that claimed authority over them seemed unwilling to defend them. And over time, frustration hardened into something more dangerous. At the center of this rising anger stood a man named Nathaniel Bacon. He wasn't a poor farmer, he was educated, connected, part of the colonial elite, but he saw what others in power ignored, and he was willing to act. Opposing him was Governor William Berkeley, a loyal servant of the crown, and a man determined to maintain order at all costs. To Berkeley, unauthorized violence was chaos. To Bacon, inaction was betrayal. And between them, a society already beginning to fracture. At first, Bacon demanded permission. He asked the governor to authorize action against frontier threats. But Berkeley refused. He feared that uncontrolled violence would tear the colony apart. To him, restraint was necessary, even if it meant leaving settlers exposed. To Bacon, it looked very different. It looked like abandonment. And so he made a decision that would change everything. He would act with or without approval. He raised a militia, not sanctioned by the government, but driven by anger and fear. Men who felt forgotten. Men who believed the system no longer served them. And for the first time, they began to act together, not as subjects, but as a force. What began as defense was quickly becoming something else. Because once violence is unleashed, it rarely stays contained. Berkeley saw the danger immediately. This was no longer about protection. It was about control, and who had the right to use force. So the governor declared Bacon a rebel, an enemy of the colony. But by then, Bacon was no longer alone. Support for the rebellion spread quickly, not just on the frontier, but across the colony. Because the grievance wasn't isolated, it was shared. And in that moment, the balance of power began to shift. The government still held authority, but it was losing control. Two visions of order now stood in opposition, one rooted in hierarchy, the other in force. And the question was no longer whether conflict would come, but how far it would go. By the summer of 1676, Virginia was no longer stable. Authority had fractured, and both sides were preparing for confrontation. Bacon marched toward Jamestown, not to petition, but to confront. The capital of the colony, the seat of government. Berkeley fled, unable to hold the city against the growing rebellion. And for a brief moment, power belonged to Bacon. But control built on force was never secure. Because the same anger that drives a rebellion can also consume it. And then, they made a decision that would define the rebellion forever. They burned it. Their own capital, reduced to ash. Not seized, not reclaimed, destroyed. In that moment, the line between order and rebellion disappeared. This was no longer about protection or even justice. It was about power and what happens when no one agrees who should hold it. The rebellion would not last. It would fracture and collapse. But the damage had already been done. Trust, once broken, does not easily return. Because this was the lesson Virginia learned the hard way. A system that excludes too many eventually loses its legitimacy. And when legitimacy disappears, force rushes in to take its place. This is what happens when a hierarchical liberty loses its foundation. Not reform, not compromise, but violence. Because liberty without trust and shared belief cannot hold. And when it breaks, it doesn't fade quietly, it burns. For the fight for liberty never ends. It only changes hands.